So this morning the plan for Bible class over the next couple of weeks is to actually start an adult instruction class. We're going to start that in 2 weeks. I was a little bit nervous about starting it the first week because it seems like whenever we roll into Bible class, the first couple of weeks is a little bit hard just getting into the groove of things, and I didn't want people to miss out on that. So one of the pastors sent this out on Clergy Talk a couple of weeks ago, and it related to a study that I went through at the end of Bible class last year, but it wasn't one that we met with in person. It was one that was just done online. And so I thought, since we've talked a lot about Christian education here, I thought this would be a valuable, gives a lot of history over not just education, but also the importance of Christian education too. So we're going to kind of go through this over the next 2 weeks. Let's begin with prayer. Oh, bless the house, whate'er befall, where Jesus Christ is all in all. Yea, if he were not dwelling there, how dark and poor and void it were. Oh, bless the house where faith ye find, and all within have set their mind to trust their God and serve him still, and do in all his holy will. O bless the parents who give heed unto their children's foremost need, and weary not of care or cost. May none to them in heaven be lost. Blessed such a house, it prospers well. In peace and joy the parents dwell, and in their children's lot is shown how richly God can bless his own. Then here will I and mine today a solemn covenant make and say, though all the world forsake thy word, I and my house will serve the Lord. Amen. The article that we have in front of us is from the Family Research Council. There are a number of different organizations that have been involved in getting information out to individuals across our country, and the Family Research Council is one of them. They have shared a lot of information regarding issues in particular of sexuality that gets involved in public schools. I don't know how many of you have heard of CSE, Comprehensive Sex Education, which was passed recently by the state of Minnesota. It was the end of last year, making mandatory sex education mandatory, and they're actually, that education is done or created by Planned Parenthood. So there's things like that this organization wants to make sure that parents they understand these are some of the things that are going on within education. So this fellow is one of the men on staff for the Family Research Council, and he just kind of does an overview on education. He starts off the article with a story that you've probably heard before. You've probably heard this illustration. There's a story about a man standing on a roof during a rising flood and praying for deliverance. In sequence, a rowboat, a powerboat, and a helicopter came by to offer help. But in each case, he declined, saying, "No thanks, I'm praying to God and he is going to save me." The man dies and goes to heaven, and upon arrival complains to God about why he wasn't rescued. God replies, "I sent a rowboat and a motorboat and a helicopter. What more did you expect?" The United States Supreme Court in Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue recently said religious schools cannot be excluded from Montana's private school tax credit program. It may be the answer we've been praying for. Granted, the hand of God isn't always obvious in court cases involving tax credits and the First Amendment, but let's take a closer look. First, a little history. So what this is going to do in this first part is he's going to talk a little bit about why it is that we are where we are as a country. And I don't think most people understand the history. I think this is a helpful review when you start to take a look at private schools versus public schools in the United States of America and how things have switched, or the tables have been flipped over in this regard. In the late 19th century, America wasn't just majority Christian, it was majority Protestant. So public schools were effectively Protestant schools. Prayer and Bible reading were common. While the culture was generally comfortable with religious education in public schools, not everyone appreciated the specific flavor of religious education that was present. Catholics didn't want their children receiving religious instruction from Protestant teachers, so they did the difficult work of starting Catholic schools. Many of those schools still exist today. The Protestants were fine with Catholics starting their own schools. They just wanted to make sure Catholic schools didn't get any tax money designated for education. So they started a campaign to prevent that from happening. The result was that 37 states placed language in their state constitutions prohibiting government funds from being used for religious education. Since the Protestants were already providing religious education in public schools, they weren't actually concerned about religious education. They were concerned about Catholic education. But they couldn't say that. These anti-aid provisions became known as Blaine Amendments in honor of U.S. Representative from Maine named James Blaine, who nearly succeeded in amending the U.S. Constitution with anti-aid language. Thank God he failed. So how many of you have heard of Blaine Amendments in recent years? Nobody, really? This has been pretty big conversation in recent years, a lot of information, and maybe it's just in certain areas. Certainly the mainline media doesn't talk about this kind of thing, but if you listen to conservative media, and I'm not talking about Fox News either, I'm talking about more than that, they talk a lot about these Blaine Amendments and some of the struggles that Christian schools are having as a result of these Blaine Amendments that are in certain states. So this recent overturn in the Supreme Court, the Espinoza case, is really big because they have basically ruled that you can't separate private education or religious education and public education. They have to be divided fairly among any of those schools that request financial aid from the government. So you might actually hear a little bit about some of these Blaine Amendments, and in the days moving forward, I think we're probably going to hear more about it, just knowing that now that you've heard it, maybe you'll hear different snippets and say, I remember talking about that in Bible class. Any thoughts or comments so far on the starting part of the history here? You know what? I don't know. That's a good question. I would guess so, because the majority of those, at least that have withheld them, are those that are more progressive from an education perspective. So, but some of those 37 have, again, like Montana, have now reversed the Blaine Amendments too. So I'm not sure what the original 37 were. Okay, going on top of page 3. As a result, many children from Christian homes are immersed in a culture which teaches, and I've got a list of, I think there are 10 things in this paragraph. Number 1, that male and female are social constructs, not biological realities. It teaches, let's see here, sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Page 2. I skipped the whole page. Page 2. In 1962, the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional for teachers to lead their children in prayer in their classroom. That decision was a small part of a broader secularizing of schools and culture. Gradually, the secularists took the reins of public education that had long been held culturally, if not legally, by Christians. In this new world, the Blaine Amendments, that had always been intended to create a religious monopoly in favor of those in power, served the purposes of the humanists rather than the Protestants. Isn't it kind of interesting how that turns upside down for the Protestants? They set this up so that the Catholics can't get the money, but as soon as the power is turned over from Christians to secularists, it's used against them so that they can't now use those funds for religious purposes. And to some degree, they got what they deserved, in a sense. It's just sad how it's turned out for our culture. However, the Protestants, and here's the real problem, the Protestants did not respond as the Catholics did to being outsiders. Despite losing control of the education provided in public schools, Protestant Christians sent their kids to public schools anyway. Today, though 70% of Americans claim to be Christians, 90% send their kids to public schools. As it turns out, it has been having an impact, and it's not a good one. So notice the difference between what Catholics did and what the Protestants did. The Catholics, when they realized that the education that they were being given, their kids were being given, they started their own schools. And that has not, in general, been the case with Protestants. Now, within Lutheranism has probably been the strongest group within Protestants to establish Christian schools. But even that, if you take a look at, for example, the ELCA doesn't have any Christian schools. You take a look at the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, they have quite a few, but percentage-wise, still a small percentage. Same thing with the Wisconsin Synod, ELS, and others. Any thoughts there so far? Going on to the next section, the secularization of the church. America is becoming less religious and has been for a while. In just the last decade, the number of people claiming to be Christian has declined 12%, from 77% to 65%. Not only is America less Christian as a percentage, the total number of professing Christians has declined from 176 million in 2009 to 167 million in 2019, even as the population increased by 23 million. So Sandy, you mentioned earlier, we've talked about the nuns before, and that's been, if you take a look at statistics of those, of a religious background, every single category of religious denomination is on the decline over the last 40 years. Every single one. Catholics, mainline, doesn't matter what category you put them in, every single one of them is declining. There's one that's increasing, and it's increasing exponentially, and that's this group that's called the religious nuns. The religious nuns are those that say, so if you think about walking into a building and they have a checkoff list and they want to know what your religious affiliation is, and it says Catholic, Lutheran, all these different check boxes. The one that says nun, that's where they get the title, the religious nuns. They're saying, I have no religious affiliation. And that is now the largest religious group in the United States. There's more nuns than there are Catholics. There are more nuns than there are Jews or Protestants or any other category. They're the largest group in the United States right now. And here's the thing. The percentages, so statistics will tell you that the religious nuns make up, the statistics vary just a little bit, but anywhere between 20 and 30% of the population. But among the millennials, those numbers, so the younger the group, the higher that number is. So among millennials, the percentage of nuns is close to 50% of the population. And if we're going to be fair, those numbers that they're reporting to us aren't actually realistic. The numbers are much bigger than they actually are, because there's a lot of people who will say, I'm Lutheran. They'll check the Lutheran box, but they don't ever go to church. They're not affiliated with their church anywhere. They just have their names on the book somewhere. So in essence, they're a religious nun, even though they're not claiming to be a religious nun. So when you add in that group of people, the religious nuns may make up close to 60-70% of the population in the United States today. So it's a huge number, and it's a growing factor. And what this article is pointing out is that where that group of people is coming from is the education that they have received over the last 30 or 40 years in our society. So when you take a look at some of these numbers, so I jotted some of these things down. I'm going to give you just a little bit of an idea of what this looks like statistically. And again, the statistics vary just a little bit, but in 1990, the percentage of those who claimed to be Christian was 85%. So that's a pretty large number of the percentage in the United States. Jump ahead 10 years, in 2001, that number was 82%. So 10 years, only a 3% decline. Jump ahead another 10 years to 2012, and the number drops to 78%. You notice a pattern? 3%, now we've got a 4% decrease. Jump ahead just 3 years, 2015, the number drops to 75%. So again, it's a growing and a speeding decline as you take a look at numbers. In 2019 then, we had the one that was listed in our study here, and that goes down to 65%. In 4 years, that number has decreased 10%. So this is, when I talk about something that's exponential, it is increasing at an increasing speed, at an increasing rate. And so this is based on the secularization of what's taking place in our society right now. Any thoughts on this so far? Going down then just a little bit further, we're at the second paragraph under the secularization of the church. What should be more concerning to the church is the fact that those who claim to be Christian don't actually believe Christian things anymore. Research by George Barna estimates that only 17% of American Christians who consider their faith to be important and attend church regularly have a biblical worldview. Think about that number. So, of those who claim to be Christian, less than 20%, their views are actually a biblical view. The rest of them have secular views, and we're going to get into some more examples of this. Not only is America becoming less Christian, the church is as well. As the convictions of the church decline, the number of ex-Christians increases. The fastest growing religious category in America is the nones, those who claim to have no religion at all. Over the last decade, the number of Protestants declined 15%, and the number of Catholics declined 12%, while the nones grew 70%. From 12% of the population to 17% in 2019. That's an additional 30 million people who now claim no religious faith. Of those, 78% grew up in the church. The church is losing its own kids. The reasons for this are undoubtedly complex, but some of it may not be that complex. Nearly 90% of children raised in Christian homes spend 30 to 35 hours a week in public schools, typically run by people who do not espouse a biblical worldview. Thank God for church and school leaders who do. Still, the goal of many parents is to keep children in a secular environment for 12 years until they are deemed academically ready to go into an institution of higher learning where the hostility to their faith of their parents is likely much more intense. This is something that I saw personally when my two oldest kids went to college. And I was astounded. I knew that in a state education, state university kind of thing, that they were going to be exposed to all kinds of junk, but both of our kids went to community colleges to begin with. And in both cases, they had teachers, and this is 2 different community colleges in 2 different states. Both of them, all of the 3 years that they were in school, had teachers who were hostile to Christianity and told them up front at the beginning of their class that their goal was to convert them from Christianity to being secular. This is in a community college atmosphere. So we kind of had this idea that that's what's going on in higher education. I was surprised that it was going on in community colleges of secular education, that we had gotten to that point, but it sort of opened my eyes as I saw this in these 2 situations. And that also included when Michael came into the family, he had a teacher at South Central as well in Mankato, and it was the same thing, that he had a teacher there that was hostile to Christianity. One of them, I think it was Catherine's teacher in Eau Claire, he was Lutheran. He grew up Lutheran. And he was now a professing atheist and had it set in his mind that he didn't want anybody else to be brainwashed by Christianity. And that was, in essence, the core of his class. It wasn't psychology, it wasn't anything else. It was, I'm going to change these kids from Christians. Any thoughts so far on page 2? Okay, page 3. I started this paragraph earlier. As a result, many children from Christian homes are immersed in a culture which teaches, 1, that male and female are social constructs, not biological realities, It teaches them, too, that good people believe marriage is a relationship between loving, committed people regardless of their gender, and they desperately want to be seen as good people. We've taught them to want that. They are taught that 3, all sex is good sex as long as everyone consents. That 4, abortion is an honorable choice. That 5, people are a threat to the planet. 6, capitalism is evil, profit is greed. 7, creation didn't happen. 8, those that started our country should be subjects of our scorn. Increasingly, they are taught 9, that gratitude and forgiveness are tools of oppression, while rage and bitterness are virtuous attempts to disrupt unjust power structures. If you take a look at these 9 things, we see this all over in our society. These are the main talking points of our society right now, and it's because that's what the generation of kids have been taught in education. In an attempt to moderate the effects of what they're taught in schools, mom and dad will take their children to church on Sunday. If they're really serious, they'll take them to a youth group on Wednesday also, but even that is happening less frequently than it once was. According to Pew, only 62% of Christians, 45% of Americans, attend church at least monthly. That number shrinks to 35% for millennials. 37% of self-identified Christians attend church somewhere between never and a few times a year. You know, this whole thing with, it mentions Sunday and then Wednesday, this is something that I've seen here in Sleepy Eye. A lot of times people say, oh, you know, we're in a little town of Sleepy Eye. We don't deal with the big stuff that goes on in the Twin Cities or in big cities. But we're struggling with the exact same thing. In the years that I've been here, it has been increasingly harder and harder to get parents to get their kids to come to catechism on Wednesdays, because there's so many things that are going on at school. So it used to be, people have told me this, it used to be that Wednesday was a holy day and there was nothing going on. You took your kids to catechism or Bible study or whatever it was going on. That is not the case anymore. They have after-school programs for the kids that are behind in whatever subject they're in. That starts right after school gets out, and that goes until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's sports that are now scheduled on Wednesdays. So now there's like about a 1-hour gap on Wednesday, and that changes depending on what kids are involved in. So there's no value that's placed on Christian education anymore. I was looking back at, in preparation for our history here at Grace, I was looking back at some of the reports from the early years here at Grace, and I was amazed to see that when Grace started, Pastor P.F. Nolting taught the public school kids 5 days a week. So we didn't have confirmation once a week, or twice a week, which is what we have now. He taught them 5 days a week, and do you know where he taught them? In the public school. He walked over to the public school and had class time in the public school to teach the kids religious instruction 5 days a week. So these are the things that have changed in recent history. So, we can talk about the fact that, well, taking prayer out of the public schools wasn't a bad thing because you get into the whole fellowship issue with that. But that's just one aspect of how religion is no longer important in the scheme of education in our world today. And this whole idea of separation of church and state, they can't have any interaction whatsoever. Well, that means that nothing church-related, nothing religious-related can be presented on the school property or have anything to do with the school. This is the mentality that we're in today. Any thoughts?
So they can preach anti-religion.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing that's ironic. You get into all of the separation of church and state, and the point that I've been trying to make for years now is that, yeah, there is a religion that's being taught in schools, and people don't want to acknowledge that. They've been taught that atheism is irreligious, but it isn't. And secularism, while it sounds irreligious, it is a religion too. It just makes human beings God. You think about what Paul says, we worship the creation rather than the creator. Well, when we become God, that is a religion too. But we don't have any problems sending our tax dollars to fund that type of religion because we don't call that religion. Any other thoughts? Okay, halfway down the page then. In an attempt to moderate the effects of what they're taught in schools, oops, sorry, we read that one. Next paragraph down. Year after year, Christian children soak up attitudes, perspectives, and loves from an environment that we hope, in the best case scenario, is neutral toward their faith. This gets right into what you were talking about, Kayla. Unfortunately, neutrality doesn't actually exist. When parents hope for neutrality, they are hoping that their child's educational environment will simply avoid any reference to faith rather than mock or ridicule it. If that's the best we can hope for, even the best case scenario is bad. Teaching children knowledge of the world without reference to God simply communicates that God is not necessary to accurately understand a world, a foundational claim of secular humanism. A biblical understanding of life is that nothing can be accurately understood without first having an accurate understanding of God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. If our hope is that our child's education will simply ignore God, we shouldn't be surprised when they form a view of the world that sees God as largely irrelevant. You know, for years, and I think this probably goes back to maybe even when your kids were in school, how many of you, when your kids were in school, were concerned about evolution in school, in public school? So that was going on even back then. But I think what we've lost sight of, number one, that wasn't the only thing, and I don't even think it was the worst thing to be concerned about in public education. But I think what we've done is we've misunderstood the impact that that view on God has had on kids. Because think about the disconnect. If you're taught that God doesn't exist, and that's what you're hearing according to the smart people that educate our society, and once a week you hear your pastor say, well, God does exist, or maybe even your parents, and you know how kids are when they get to a certain age and nothing that mom or dad say is correct? At some point, there's going to be this challenge to their faith, and they're going to put more stock in what they have heard over and over and over again in school, because they're the smart ones. They know this stuff, as opposed to mom and dad, who they're stupid. They don't know any better. That's going to be the result. And you know how that is with Sunday school. You know, Sunday school, oh, that's kid stuff. That stuff that I heard in Sunday school, that's really not all that. Those are just stories, as opposed to what I hear in school. That's the truth. And so that has played a major role and impact, I think, in kids, not just in the reality of does God exist. Now, a lot of people are coming out, they're saying, yeah, I believe that God exists, I just don't know who he is. That's the religious nuns. They're saying, I can't be sure, and I really don't need to go to church in order to find that out, because it's been demonstrated to be true that church really isn't as smart as what I thought they were. There are other people that are smarter than the people that are in church. Again, you know, over the last 6 years since I've been here, I've had parents come to me and bring to me examples from the public school right here, showing me the things that are being taught to the kids in our community. And a lot of times we think, well, we're immune to that, it's not going to affect us. And some of those things are more subtle. There was one confirmation student that had, in science class, they were studying the existence of the world and how it came to be and evolution. And in that case, he said, well, yep, we're taught, you know, God doesn't exist. This happened by chance. This is all that it is. Another student, this is maybe less, a lot of times people say, oh, that's not really that big of a deal. One student came in, I don't know if I've told you the story. This was last year. A student came into catechism class, and I asked the class, this is the public school class, if they knew who Abraham Lincoln was. And only one student raised their hand and knew who Abraham Lincoln was. And when the hand went up, the student said, he was a bad man. And I thought, okay, she must have him confused with somebody else. So I asked her, I said, you know, why do you say that Abraham Lincoln was a bad man? And the student went on and said, well, he killed 300 Indians. And so as I pursued and followed up with that, I found out that they were going through Minnesota history this year. And they had been taught that Abraham Lincoln, during the Indian uprising here in the state of Minnesota, had 300 Indians hung because of, I don't know what they were taught exactly why they were hung. Well, the reality of that story was that there were over 300 Indians that were arrested because of the uprising here. They had killed 800 settlers. And Abraham Lincoln commuted the sentence of 300 of them. Only 30 of them ultimately were hung. So not only were the facts wrong, at least as far as what she had heard, but this fits into the historical narrative of our society that is mentioned up a little bit further. If you look up next to the coloring box there, those who started our country should be subjects of our scorn. We're seeing more and more of that as people are tearing down statues of so-and-so. This is that if they were white, they had to be wrong. They had to be oppressors. Never mind the fact that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves. He allowed 30 Indians to be hung who deserved to be hung because they killed 800 citizens and settlers of Minnesota. So this is the change that's taking place, and this is, again, it's not necessarily the teacher's fault. A lot of times the teacher doesn't know any better, but they're not seeing the fact that this fits into the narrative that people higher up the chain want to bring about in order to bring about change in our society. And this is dangerous too. It's not just theistic evolution or evolution by itself. There's other things that are being influencing the next generation of our kids. And if they can't trust Abraham Lincoln, who are they going to trust? It's no wonder that we have people that are rising up and tearing down statues of these individuals that we have heard stories about and learned about that founded our country on solid biblical principles nonetheless. Were they sinful? Absolutely. Did they make mistakes? Yes. But who doesn't? And at what point do we stop tearing down those statues? Any thoughts on that?
Maybe the statue should never been put up.
Well,
We're gonna honor this,
it's kind of like in the history of Lutheranism, when Martin Luther went away to the Wartburg Castle after the Stand of Worms, Andreas Karlstadt, one of the other Lutheran leaders, came out and started tearing down all of the crosses and icons, everything that was in the church. And that was when Luther came out of the Wartburg. He said, there's nothing wrong with those things. If we worship them, there's a problem. And so you're right, those things can become an object of idolatry, but they don't have to be. And that was the point that Luther was making, is that if we use them properly, we can learn from them. He wanted to use those as a teaching tool. And that's what they should be used for us too, is to learn both from the good as well as from the mistakes that those leaders made in our history. But again, how can you learn either of those things if we're only taught a false narrative of what they actually did? Any other thoughts? All right, going down to the bottom of page 3, we're at the last full paragraph, the small one. To paraphrase Vodi Bachman, if we send our kids to be educated by Caesar, we have no right to be surprised if they act like Romans. The church, of course, is aware that young people are leaving, and many church leaders are humble enough to try to understand why. Since efforts at self-reflection have led to a variety of conclusions, often informed by surveys of those who have left, we're too hypocritical, the church says. We're not relatable enough. We're trying too hard to be relatable. We talk too much about politics. We don't talk enough about social justice. We aren't doing a good enough job of answering hard questions. We're too anti-science. So these are some of the things that the church, that he's talking about, the church reflecting on why there are so many people leaving the church. The problem is that as the church does that, they're coming to the wrong conclusion. Instead of saying, we're not acting enough like society, we need to act more like society and receive and accept some of the things that society is accepting, which is what many churches are actually doing. They're becoming more like the society in order to maintain the kids that are leaving. That's not the right answer. Largely missing is an assessment of why kids who grew up in the church think worship styles or human hypocrisy have anything to do with whether Jesus is Lord of all. The Nehemiah Institute annually administers the Peers Test among high school students, which seeks to identify a person's worldview in 5 categories: politics, economics, education, religion, and social issues. Each statement is framed to either agree or disagree with a biblical principle. Based on their responses, a student's worldview is placed in one of 4 categories: biblical theism, moderate Christian, secular humanism, or socialism. So based on these questions related to these 5 categories, they're placing kids in one of these 4 areas of the spectrum. So biblical theism would be a religious, biblically founded view. Socialism is on the opposite side of the spectrum. In 2015, tests showed that 90% of students from Christian homes that attended public schools score in a range that indicates their views are grounded in basic tenets of secularism. That's the third to last, or second to last. So that's just one step above socialism. And as you take a look at what's going on in our country today, you can see that there's a lot that fall into the socialist category as well. 90% of students. That's 10% that's spread into those other 3 categories, and some of those are socialist. So this is a serious issue. The problem of young people walking away from their faith is not fundamentally about music styles, skinny jeans, or hymnals. The problem is that the education and information of Christian kids has been outsourced to people outside the church. As a result, they have learned to love the wrong things. The answer to that question can't be fixed with a guitar, haircut, or a new sermon series. So notice how they're responding to what many churches are trying to do in order to get the kids to come back. And he's pointing out, that's not going to work. We have a bigger problem than just what kind of worship we're doing. That's not the root problem of why our kids are leaving the church. This is why every church needs to start a Christian school. We don't need to retreat from the world. We need to build the communities and institutions that allow the gospel to be the most significant influence on our children. We have to stop outsourcing education. Many Christian families send their children to public schools in the hope that they will be missionaries. To their credit, some students have done just that. But they are remarkable because they are the exception rather than the rule. On balance, the culture is doing a much better job of converting Christian kids than Christian kids are doing of converting their peers, and it isn't close. In fact, almost half of millennial Christians, 47%, believe that it is at least somewhat wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in the hopes of converting them. That would be intolerant. So if we're sending our kids to public school saying, well, we want you to convert the kids that are not going to church, we have to realize that the mentality that they have is that's an intolerant thing for me to do. So a large majority of our kids are saying, that's wrong. I'm not going to go to school and try to convert my kids to Christianity. So they're not being witnesses, even though that's a noble goal. I think it's a wrong goal. We don't want to send our kindergartner in when they haven't had the Christian instruction and training in dealing with proselytizing. That's the kind of thing that we need to be training them until they get to be high school or college age, so that when they get to be that point, then they're equipped and able to do the work of Christian evangelism. Any thoughts?
Yeah, going back to that test, it's bothering me.
The Peers test?
Yeah, they're giving it to high school students. Now, my experience in my teenagers, that's when they objected against me the most. So why are they testing it at that level? I mean, that's when the child acts out and going to answer opposite of what a parent says.
Sure. You know, I don't know why they've chosen. My guess is it has to do with the questions. And to be honest, Kayla, I think that one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years is that we have been thinking all of this incorrectly in the church. When I was a kid, the idea was our kids are not going to be influenced by this garbage until they get into the high school, college level. And what we've missed is the fact that this has been going on in elementary and middle school for a long time. And I think that might be the result of that they're testing them at that level because that's where the greater opposition comes from. But what I'm seeing is that more and more people are starting to realize, and this is something that I see with catechism students and kids that are coming from the public school, that this stuff is being indoctrinated to them at an early age. So this might change, that they start testing kids at an early level. But I think this is the idea that the church for many, many years has thought those are not dangerous years. It's not until they reach high school or college that their faith is going to be attacked in secular education. So I don't know for sure. That would just be my gut guess on why that's.
They're just kind of picking and choosing where they get their information from in this article.
In what sense?
Well, the most turbulent years for a young person are the teen years. And that's when they're put them into 4 categories. Well, we're categorizing when a child is probably showing off his worst side.
Well, I'll tell you from personal example that if we were to run, again, I don't know what their questions are on the Peers test, but if we were to run a Peers test for the kids in this congregation, I would guess that we would get similar numbers. And that's from the kids that are in grade school. So my guess is the reason they're not choosing this test because it's giving the answers that they want. It's the only test that's available that's doing that. I don't think that they're testing kids at elementary and middle school levels. And I think the reason for that is because they're thinking this is where kids are being confronted with their Christian viewpoint in the high school, college level. So that's, I think, where that's coming from. And again, from what I've seen from the kids that come from across the street when we have after-school Bible study, the secularization is already there. It's built into it. So it's not just when you get to high school, and it's not just because of the rebellion against their parents. That starts much earlier on. Any other thoughts? The bottom of the page 4. On some level, we understand why Christian families send their kids to public schools. They don't want their kids in an environment that will kill their souls. They just feel that they don't have real options. Homeschooling is not possible for every family, and private school is an additional expense. Which brings us back to Espinoza. In Espinoza, the Supreme Court said it is unconstitutional to exclude religious schools from school choice programs intended for private schools. In plain English, this means that vouchers and tax credits can now be used to send kids to Christian schools. This is new. For more than a century, state Blaine amendments have forbidden this almost everywhere, but the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional to exclude religious schools from these programs. The First Amendment does not forbid cooperation between governments. It requires the government to treat all religious organizations equally. Today, 26 states have some form of voucher program, education savings accounts, individual tuition tax credits, scholarship tax credit programs, or special needs program that allows parents to use education dollars at private schools. Most are limited in scope, and 24 states have no school choice options of any kind. So that's almost 50% of the states. The United States spends over $700 billion a year on education, or $13,847 per student. That's the average. The amount varies dramatically by state. New York spends over $23,000 per student, where Idaho spends the least at $7,486 per student. I thought you hear a lot of the high cost of education in the United States of America. It's one of the highest cost per student. I think it might be the highest of any modern country in our world. So I did some quick math just to figure out what we spend per student at Grace. And even though we have a very small student body, we're under $6,000 per student. That means we're less. In a private school setting, we spend less per student than the state of Idaho, which is the smallest, the shortest amount of any state in the United States of America. It pales in comparison to $23,000. And the education that our students get, you can't even compare it to the education that's being received in these state schools. So an interesting, you talk a lot about number, and the answer for many people is, well, if we throw more money at the education system, we'll fix it. Well, historically, that has not been the case, because the more money you throw at it, the more money goes into, and this is going to talk more about the lobbying and all the other things that play into education as well. I'm going to read these next two paragraphs and we'll break here. Wherever you live, the money is now constitutionally free to be used by school programs to fund religious education as directed by the parents. But it won't happen automatically. Two things have to happen first. State legislators have to pass or expand school choice laws, and churches need to start enough schools so that there are real quality alternatives for Christian families. The Espinoza decision does not move any child from a harmful school environment into an ideal one. It does, however, give us a green light to do so if we're willing to do the work. Here's what needs to happen. And then we'll go on in that next week. I think that what he points out here is valuable information as far as understanding what needs to happen. I've talked with Hagedorn about school choice, and he's one of those proponents for school choice and wanting to change it, but his hands are tied in many ways as far as the powers that be don't want school choice. And in the next section, we're going to see why that is, why there's so much animosity to starting not just Christian schools, but any type of private schools, because the money shrinks and the money gets taken away. I've actually heard from Mr. C over here that he gets upset when students leave the public school and come over here because they lose their funding. Their tax dollars go down, so they're upset. And he's never said it to me, but I've heard through the grapevine of things that he said when I'm not there about the fact that they're frustrated when students pick up and come over to us. So we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. The problem, and again, this is as I've seen it, it's not enough just to do what he's talking about here. It's not enough to go through the motions and change. These things are important. We need to change it so that schools, there are dangers too when it comes to funding from the government with Christian schools. So we have to understand that. I'm not completely agreed with what he's saying here, but some of the things that need to take place as far as opening things up for parents to be able to make a choice as to where they send their kids is an important first start. But we have a Christian day school, and not every parent decides to send their kids here. So there's not just the problem of having a Christian day school. It's also the problem of educating people as far as what is actually taking place in public education. That's one of the things that I've really tried to do since I've been here the last couple of years, is inform people of what is actually going on. And a lot of people just don't want to hear it. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. In talking to people, I think part of it is they're afraid of what their friends are going to say if they pull their kids out of school. So that plays a little bit of a role. There's reasons that are there, but they're ultimately not good reasons if we want to open our eyes to see what's actually being taught to our kids. That's the danger. Any thoughts? So next week we'll pick it up with some of the direction that he has there on the bottom of page 5. If you have the chance, if you want to read through this over the course of this week, I'd like to finish this up next week so that we can start the regular study that we have planned moving forward. There's a lot of references in this study, and ultimately what I'd like to have, I've talked a lot about Christian education, public education, secular education. I think the one thing that needs to happen is that we need to have discussion on it. I know that there are people that disagree with me, and that's within our own congregation, but people don't want to have that discussion. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. If part of it is that there's always a danger with disagreement. And in our world today, disagreement, you and I can have a disagreement, we can fight, and then we don't like each other after we're all done. That shouldn't be the way that it is. We can have a disagreement and still be on the same page as far as other aspects. But this is something that's pretty serious, and more and more I'm seeing, I don't know that you can dispute the evidence that this fellow presents. I'm not sure that there's another way of looking at it. There are other causes. There's a lot of other examples of secularism in our society, but I think our public school system has been one of the largest proponents of causing the religious decline in our country that we have in the last 2 generations, maybe generation and a half. Any thoughts before we close? This might be it for church. We might just have a couple of people joining us, so you might be it. Let's close with the blessing of our Lord. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.